On today's episode of Faith and Focus, I want to discuss the wildly popular Netflix series Dahmer, about the life of Jeffrey Dahmer. And I want to talk about it just as reviewing it as what I thought of the show and content and subject matter. But I want to discuss more deeply the element of faith, forgiveness, sin, and the kind of those elements and how they tie into the show and the message of the show. So that's what we're going to talk about on this episode. I hope you enjoy it. Hey guys, if you've been a listener of Faith and Focus for a while and have enjoyed what you've been hearing, I would love it if you would consider becoming a monthly supporter of the ministry. As a missionary within faith, my work is entirely supported by listeners like you who believe in the work God has called me to do, and podcasting is just a small part of that. I also teach the Bible at my local church, in the ministry house I live in, and with the young men God has put in my life to disciple. I also do biblical counseling that is entirely donation-based, so your monthly support goes in part to help support counseling sessions for people who may not be able to afford any or all of the cost of counseling. And with your monthly support, I would be able to go on to full-time ministry, which would include more podcast recording, new podcast ideas that we've had, and different forms of online teaching, as well as more availability for counseling sessions. If you'd like to become a monthly supporter, you can email me at dennissotheby@infaith.org or head over to infaith.com/Dennis-Sotheby. Thank you. Well, if you haven't watched the show Dahmer that just came out earlier this month on Netflix, you probably have a lot of friends on Facebook that are talking about it. I think it is like the number one streamed show in I thought I saw something like 70 different countries. It's like the number one streamed show. And of course, there's a lot of questions and discussion that happens around these kinds of shows and documentaries and series, just because of the subject matter. Is it glorifying this, these sick serial killer type people? They're people profiting off of, and these are actually themes that kind of come up in the show as well. Are people profiting off of, these victims and what this person has done? And, there's no denying that there is some kind of obsession with people, and we kind of think of this as a modern phenomenon, this obsession with true crime and serial killers, murder. And if you read books, there's a couple books by a guy named Harold Schechter, who is he's a professor of English literature, but he shows up a lot. He's more popular, I think, known as like a true crime writer. He writes about different crimes and serial killers. He did a book on Ed Gein. He did one on H.H. Holmes, which was quite good. But he does a lot of interviews about true crime stuff. That's what he's most popularly known as. But he talks about how this is not a modern phenomenon, people's obsession with true crime and with murder. This goes back, certainly all the way back to even Ed Gein, which I think was in the 50s, maybe late 50s. People came from all over the nation when they heard about this story. And obviously it popularized true crime stuff. Psycho, Norman Bates from Psycho was based on Ed Gein. Hannibal Lecter, Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs was based on Ed Gein. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, based on Ed Gein. So, and it goes back even further, all the way back to Civil War times, people in the Wild West. Harold Schechter talks about this. There's always been this obsession, and it's kind of I'm not a psychologist, but, I'm interested in this stuff even. And people, my friends, often think I'm a little bit too obsessed with it. I often will joke about talking about true crime and serial killers on like a first date. And, it is interesting because people wonder, especially within the Christian community, because it's such a dark subject matter, why think about these things, why talk about them, and why meditate on them. And certainly you can go overboard, I think. But what I think is interesting and what I think captures people's imaginations, is it is the fact that it is almost like a look into the darkest part of humanity. Sometimes I think we can feel fairly removed from how bad humanity really is. And as Christians, we know and understand that there are none righteous. Nobody, as far as, from God's perspective, is any more righteous than the other. We're all in sin. And so I think that there is an impulse in people. You might call it the flesh. You might call it indwelling sin, as far as biblical terminology. But just this nature, this darker nature in humanity that most of us don't live out or exhibit to the extent that a Jeffrey Dahmer does, or a John Wayne Gacy, or a Ted Bundy. So when we see it happen, I think there's a resonance and a familiarity with it. As much as we're appalled by it, there's something that's like, I don't want to say attractive, because I don't think it's like attractive, but I think it's like almost like a train wreck. You have to kind of look at it and think, holy cow, And a lot of the questions, and this is a big theme of the show Dahmer, is how did this happen? What happened to him? Who caused this to happen? How does a person go so far off the rails? So I think it's interesting to think about, and I want to look at the show and the story of Jeffrey Dahmer and kind of bring in some Christian elements, some biblical elements. And, there'll be spoilers if you haven't watched the show. And I understand a lot of people listening to a podcast about Christian stuff. This is probably not going to be the subject matter you're going to want to watch anyway. So maybe you're not even interested in watching Dahmer. So I'm not telling you to go out and watch it. If R-rated stuff, bothers you, if it offends your conscience, there's homosexuality in it, because he was a homosexual. There is violence and gore. It's not the sexuality and the violence and the gore do not go as far as you could if you really wanted to be gratuitous. So it is relatively tame compared to how I think some people may have presented this material. But as far as the show, I thought it was really good. Jeffrey Dahmer, in my opinion, is one of the more interesting serial killers that exist, just because of the elements of his life that there does seem to be this conflict. He doesn't seem to be the things that he did were monstrous and horrifying and clearly seem psychopathic. How does a person kill 17 people and dismember and cannibalize them and all of this stuff? And certainly those things are horrifying. But the thing that's interesting about Jeffrey Dahmer is they were horrifying to him too. And so there, if you haven't seen it, I'm just going to put up front, there's going to be spoilers, because I'm not going to try to tiptoe around. If you don't know the life of Jeffrey Dahmer yet, in the story of how things happen, this is a fairly good adaptation in the show. So even talking about Dahmer's life, you're kind of spoiling elements of the show. But the thing about Jeffrey Dahmer is and this is not, you probably would think, like, why would we take, somebody who's a psychopath or something, why would we take them at their word? They're evil people. But this is coming from, there's a excellent, you can find him on YouTube, and I'll link him in the show notes, interviews with a guy named Park Dietz, and he's a forensic psychiatrist, and he interviewed Dahmer, he interviewed Richard Kuklinski, who was a hitman, he interviewed the gentleman who tried to kill Reagan. I can't think of his name off the top of my head. But, he interviews criminals, and so he can understand their thinking. And he even says, Dahmer, and this is in accordance with Dahmer's own testimony, is that he didn't enjoy killing his victims. You have people like Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy. These people are like sexual thrill killers. It's part of the sexuality is the actual killing of the people. So that is a bizarre compulsion in and of itself. How does something like that happen? But for Dahmer, the killing was almost the disgusting part of it. He didn't enjoy it, and he didn't want to do it. And even in the show and in his life, he tried to find very maladaptive ways to avoid killing people. Now, none of these things are good, obviously, but he didn't want to kill people. And what it seemed to be what his problem was, he had like this issue of abandonment, this compulsion to keep people with him. He did not want people to leave him. And the show really brings this out, just the abandonment that he suffered and that kind of traumatic part of his childhood. And so he had this strange fear and this trauma of people leaving him. So that's a part of his psyche. And Park Dietz talks about this in some of the interviews he gives. He didn't want people to leave him. So so he was homosexual, but that doesn't really matter. People think like, there's always questions like if he didn't have to suppress his homosexuality because it was, the 80s, early 90s where it was taboo. His family was not, Christian, they went to church. So did him having to hide his sexuality? And he says, no, not at all. And I think that's probably accurate. If he was heterosexual, he would have just done what he did to men, but he would have done it to women. So his sexual desire was to have men with him. And in one interview with Park Dietz, he talks about how what he wanted was a completely compliant sexual partner, somebody who would not make demands, who would be submissive and not in like a violent way, but who would just do what Dahmer wanted to do. He wanted to just lay with them and hold them and basically not allow them to leave. So that was what his compulsion was. It wasn't to kill people, it was to have somebody with him and not leave him. So in the show and in his life, you see him doing things like he steals this mannequin, this male mannequin, and holds that and sleeps with that and has his fantasies about that. It's his way of trying to, not, you have to kidnap somebody and hold them against their will to do what he was interested in. And so then there's other things, where he goes to bars and he drugs people and takes them to like a hotel or a bathhouse and he sleeps with them for the night. He just is holding them and that's all he wants. The person's completely passed out. They're not leaving him. Was his fear and his attraction. So even the killing was, you would have a one night stand. He would bring a guy back and then the person would leave because that's what you would do after you hooked up with somebody. And he didn't want them to leave. So in killing them, he would keep them there with him. They wouldn't be allowed to leave. And so because he was so repulsed by the killing and having to, to cover up what he was doing, that's why, he had this alcoholism. And so he would have to get very drunk to do this. And the drugging part of it was because he didn't want to hurt these men. Like he even says, like, I didn't do this because I hated them. I did it because it was like a form of love, like, in a twisted way. And, so, he would drug them so they would be unconscious. He would be drunk himself so he wouldn't, feel what he was doing and know what he was really doing. And so it was all an attempt to just keep the people with him. So that was where the cannibalism played in, was, keeping them with him and keeping their body, with them in certain forms of dismemberment and all that kind of stuff. So that's what's interesting about him, is he didn't enjoy the killing. The killing was just kind of a means to an end. Now, that in and of itself is kind of horrendous because, it basically views like he had a compulsion. Like we would say, I have a compulsion and a need to eat. And, McDonald's is, I'll go to McDonald's and then I'll just throw the trash away. It's viewing that stuff as just like, what I need is what I want, the compulsion to fulfill. And the remnants, the leftover, that whatever, who cares? Like, just throw it away. Now, that's horrifying. But what's interesting about Dahmer, and this is why I find him so intriguing and why the show really does an effective job at this, is it shows how conflicted he is about this. because he knows it's wrong. And that's why he was deemed not insane, because he knew what he was doing was wrong. He wasn't criminally insane. And so what's interesting, and why you can relate to somebody like Dahmer, and why I think as Christians it's helpful, we don't want to think about this stuff on, all the time. It's not good to think about this stuff all the time, but why it's helpful to think about, that situation that he was in. He somehow, and nobody knows how, he somehow developed this compulsion, in this attraction, in this, that got warped with his sexual desires from a young age for like gore, the insides of people. I mean, it started with animals, but like that sexual attraction to those things. And we might look at that and say that's horrifying. And yeah, it is. And it's completely abnormal and it's completely horrifying. But the reality is, we all have weird things that we have compulsions to do, and we don't really know how they happen and how they're formed. But we know that they're wrong. And sometimes we still act out on them, but we know they're wrong. And so sometimes we think, well, if a person's doing something, they must not care, or they must not think that it's wrong. And that's not the case. And that's why I think it's helpful to not look at somebody like Dahmer and say, that is that kind of a person, but I'm not like that. I mean, it is a very stark reality of the Pharisee and the tax collector praying, and he's saying, I thank you, God, that I'm not like this person over here. But when you look at somebody like a Dahmer, and you think about your own life, think about maladaptive things that you do and that you engage in. I think about people who have addiction to pornography. I've known people and I've worked with people who, it's such a compulsion that you want to just say, well, just stop doing it. Like, that it's wrong. You're crying. You don't know why you're doing it, but you just can't stop. There are certain triggers that happen that just set you down this path of looking at pornography, and people will say, I just can't stop. And it's not just a matter of willpower. It's not necessarily that they don't care. It's just such this ingrained compulsion. And a lot of it happens because in the same way, that Dahmer became, what he was, starting from a young age, of abandonment, of traumatic abandonment, of neglect, of at a very young age being introduced to, cutting up animals and enjoying that, and dissecting them and observing their insides. And then at puberty, that being melded with sexuality. That's years and years and years of a compulsion being ingrained in somebody. But somebody who might be addicted to pornography, you got to think, in our day and age, if you take a child who is exposed to pornography at 7 years old, 8 years old, which is not uncommon anymore, especially with the advent of technology, kids can be viewing pornography at such a young age, which in a sense is a form of child abuse, right? If an adult is showing pornography to a child, that would be abusive. That's not acceptable. So if a child from the age of 8 until 12 or 13 is viewing pornography as just a taboo, as just a thing that I shouldn't be doing, but there's obviously not much of a sexual component to it, because children can't really be sexual. But once puberty hits, and now they're taking their compulsion and they're melding it with sexuality. Now you've got, from 13 to 20, 7 years of sex and all of the hormones that go along with that being combined with pornography and porn use. And of course it's shameful. They know it's wrong, but they don't tell anyone. Who can you talk to about that? You think of even a kid and growing up in the church, you can't. We're always told that you can talk to your youth pastor and that you should be, but it's so shameful. Nobody wants to talk about it. And that's one of the things Dahmer says, is who would I ever have talked to that I had these fantasies of hurting people with sex, and knocking people out so that they would, so that I could lay with them. And, who would he talk to? It was unspeakable. And so these things just harbor in secret. So by the time someone's 20, 21, 22, and they're an adult, now they have, 12, 13, 14, 15 years of this secret compulsion that has just been being fed, and they can't stop. I mean, it is so ingrained. So you've got abuse, you've got neglect, trauma, and then sexuality all melded together to form this, horrifying compulsion that people know is wrong. They know it's wrong, and they would like to stop, but it just takes so much work and if it's unspeakable, if you can't even talk about it and mention it, and so then so all that to say, that's why you can relate to somebody like a Dahmer when you watch this in this show, and the performances are excellent. I mean, all of them. Evan Peters, who played Jeffrey Dahmer, you see people online saying that guy needs to get psychiatric help because you think of like Heath Ledger with the Joker and those kinds of things. It's like he did such a good job at going to such a dark place. Hopefully he gets some help and doesn't stay in that dark place. But such good performances, and by the time you get to the last episode, and again, spoiler alerts, he ends up being killed in prison. At least I did, but I think they did an effective job of you feeling sympathy for Jeffrey Dahmer, and you definitely feel the emotions that his father is feeling. His father, who stuck with him, all the way after his incarceration, and you can see interviews with Stone Phillips and Jeffrey Dahmer and his dad. And his dad wrote a book trying to think about, how did this happen? Did I contribute to this? And just all that stuff. And it just tore him up. And so you can see that human emotional side of it, that, yes, you can say, Jeffrey Dahmer was a monster, but he was still a human. And you can see it. And if you are able to identify yourself with that part of Jeff Dahmer, to say this was a person who went very far off the rails. And he couldn't even figure out how it happened. He hated it, but he didn't know how it happened and why he was saddled with these compulsions and where they came from. And what I find interesting, so, all that to say, that's what I find interesting about this subject matter. And that's what I think the show did an excellent job doing, was showing you that side of things. How, you can watch it and kind of say, oh, wow, the way his parents' divorce, his mom's health issues, and the way his dad treated him, the alcoholism, all of these things kind of played a part in really warping this person. And then the show does a good job of showing how the victims' families, viewed this and how this impacted their lives. And so there's a lot going on in the show that I think they handle, very well. And what I think, what I enjoyed, if I can say that, the most about the show was the last episode. And even if you don't watch the whole show, again, because of the content and stuff, the last show, episode 10, God of Forgiveness and God of Vengeance, he's already in prison. You don't really need to know the backstory. Everyone knows Jeffrey Dahmer's backstory of, killing 17 people, cannibalizing stuff. But the last episode is really, the final part of his life. He's in jail. It's still R-rated. There's language, there's violence and stuff. But this is the episode that really shows his conversion. And again, we can't know somebody, certainly someone we don't actually know. None of us probably, none of you listening to this probably had met Jeffrey Dahmer, but we don't know him. We didn't know him, but when you look at interviews and things that he did and said, that he did seem to genuinely have a conversion in prison, the last year or so of his life, couple years of his life. And the show does capture that. And this last episode does capture that. And what I think they do a wonderful job doing is they juxtapose it with John Wayne Gacy. So in real life, the day that John Wayne Gacy was executed was the day that Jeffrey Dahmer was baptized. So the show kind of, what it does is it kind of in that last episode is paralleling and contrasting Dahmer with John Wayne Gacy. So John Wayne Gacy is like, kind of like the anti-Dahmer. I mean, he has so many similarities, but he was a male, homosexual, killed, I think 30-something young men, killed them, there was sex involved, and then, had them buried under his home. And so it kind of opens with Gacy and, showing some of his crimes, one of his crimes in particular. And then it kind of has his story after his arrest interweaved with that last episode. And the thing that you see about Gacy is he never was remorseful for what he did. He was very arrogant. In fact, at the end in his last interview that he was giving, he's denying that he did this, that somebody else did it, and that they framed him. He's kind of arrogantly saying, yeah, me and God are on good terms. I serve communion at the Catholic Church, and I'm not afraid of death because, God and I have a great relationship. And he's just the polar opposite of Dahmer. And then even on his execution, his last words are "kiss my," insert profanity here. So, I mean, there was just no remorse. There was no repentance. And then here you have Dahmer in the last episode, and he sits with a priest, and he's talking with him and asks, could somebody like John Wayne Gacy really be forgiven? And the priest said, are you really asking about Gacy? Or are you asking about yourself? And, Dahmer kind of, acknowledges he's talking about himself. And what I think is amazing that this show included was the priest tells him, and this is why I think it's important for us as Christians to understand that these people like Jeffrey Dahmer are not different than us. They just go further than us, maybe. And this really then addresses these issues of how seriously do we take the grace of God? How seriously do we take the forgiveness of God? Can God forgive somebody like Jeffrey Dahmer and the things that he did? And so the priest tells him, yes, that's why it's called grace. It's because we don't deserve it. Nobody deserves it. So that's why it's called grace. And so he tells him the story of the thieves on the cross that were crucified with Jesus. And, when Jesus is dying, one person is, not repentant. They're railing against Jesus. Save us. Save your, we didn't do anything wrong. We don't, whatever. And save us. So that's kind of almost like Gacy. And then you have the other one who is repentant, and he says, remember me when you come in your kingdom. And Jesus tells him, today you'll be with me in paradise. So just like that, this person who, we don't know what they did, but they're apparently so heinous that they were being executed for it. And he gets forgiveness just like that, the grace, radical grace and forgiveness of God. And then, of course, what happens at the crucifixion is there's a solar eclipse. It goes dark or whatever. And so what they do in this last episode is they portray, they give that kind of gospel message of God's grace and his forgiveness. And Dahmer believes that, receives that, and wants to be baptized. And so as Gacy's being executed, it's cutting back and forth between Gacy being executed. There's a solar eclipse happening in the sky, and then Dahmer's being baptized. So as one is dying in his sins and unrepentant, another person is repenting and receiving forgiveness. And it's a really amazing shot, and it's very powerful. And that's why I think it's so important to look at this story. Again, you don't have to be, indulgent about serial killers necessarily, but then when something like this happens, it really shows us like this person was a human being. Sinful, yes, obviously. There's no denying his sinfulness. And yet, God's grace and God's mercy and God's forgiveness can be extended even to him. So as you look at somebody like Jeff Dahmer, and you realize this person, how did they get such twisted compulsion, addiction to something that is so horrifying? Well, again, think of your darkest thoughts or fantasies or temptations or things that maybe you indulge, and you just think, what would have to happen to me to push me into those? Or maybe you're somebody who does engage in those compulsions and indulge those compulsions, and you're not happy about it. You hate it. You hate that part of you, that thing, whatever that is doing that. And you want deliverance from that. You want rescue from that. So Dahmer's rescue was in alcoholism. He was a raging drunk. But God's forgiveness still extended to him. So that, in a way, offers hope to us, like, wow, from God's point of view, am I different than a Jeffrey Dahmer? Well, no. we've all sinned. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. And yet God's grace and his forgiveness is still extended to us in the same way that it was extended to Jeff Dahmer. And then, of course, he's killed in prison. And we obviously don't know exactly what happened because, and the show is very accurate. Again, I've read quite a bit about, the real life story of Jeff Dahmer and seen several documentaries. So this is fairly accurate what they portray in the show. There's somebody who was crazy who thought it was God's calling to bring wrath and vengeance on Dahmer, and it's unclear, how did he get alone with Jeff Dahmer and this other person in the show. The theory is the guards let them, they knew what he was going to do, and they let him, and so he kills the one guy, the guy who's doing work duty along with Jeff Dahmer. He kills him, and Jeff hears it happening, and that was one of the things about Jeff Dahmer, that he was, remorseful, is he wanted the execution. He thought he deserved to die for what he did. So he hears the person being murdered, and the guy comes out, and the person who was murdered in real life had defensive wounds. He was fighting back and not wanting to be killed, obviously. And so then when Chris Scarver approaches Dahmer, he, kind of in a way of weird poetic justice, uses a dumbbell, which is what Dahmer used to kill his first victim. And he basically tells him, God sent me to execute vengeance and judgment on you. And Dahmer just says, okay. But he tells the guy, I think that God has forgiven me for what I've done. But, essentially, if God has sent you to execute me, then so be it. And he doesn't fight back. He doesn't, and in real life, there was no defensive wounds on Dahmer. He didn't try to protect himself or defend himself. And so, and by the time you reach the end of the show, I think most people watch that and you do feel like, wow, that is you don't want to say I sympathize with Jeff Dahmer, but they do an excellent job of making you feel like, wow, I can almost in some way relate to him. And I think that was the point of the show. And of course they interweave and they do a good job of showing, the victims and the struggle that they have with forgiveness and forgiving Jeff Dahmer. And, who could do that easily? I think it would be impossible. It would almost have to be an act of God to be able to forgive something like that. But the reality of God's forgiveness is there. And again, we can't know for sure. But isn't it just an amazing testimony of God's grace that he could take somebody like a Jeff Dahmer and bring them to a point of repentance and forgiveness. And again, in the show, excellent performances. His dad, he's weeping, over his dead son, and who wouldn't? So there's this love of the father for his son. But I think a powerful show. Again, it's not, I do highly recommend it, but again, I recommend it with the asterisk that, what content you can tolerate and you're comfortable watching it in good conscience. So, it's an R. It earns its R rating. There's homosexuality. It's not, but the thing that I do appreciate about this show is it wasn't, you could take something like this and make it very gratuitous and very graphic. And of course there's, killing that is violent, but you could have, like Saw, like just violent blood splurting, dismemberment kind of stuff. They do enough to make it effective, but they don't go overboard. There's a lot of cutaways, and ending the scenes and stuff like that. And even the sexuality, of course there's nudity, but it's not, you could see a show being very graphic and relatively tame, but still it earns its R rating. So that stuff is in there. So if that, if you're not comfortable with that stuff, of course don't watch this, but I'm just saying as a show, as a storytelling, they did an excellent job. Very real life, very accurate performances. People who hear Jeff Dahmer in real life and then hear, the actor, it's like, it's amazing. It's an incredible performance and well told. It's not a horror per se. It's more of a drama thriller. I was shocked by that. I expected, again, gore, violence, horror, scariness. And of course it's tense. there's a thriller, and the subject matter is scary, but it is much more of a drama, and a story of telling, his life, and you kind of are left wondering, how did this happen? So I highly recommend it. I think it will win some awards. It definitely deserves them. If it doesn't win them, but it definitely deserves some awards. And I think, again, it highlights the humanness. Even you can take somebody as depraved and as monstrous as Jeffrey Dahmer, and you realize he is a human like you or I, who went way off track. And we don't know how those things happen, and how those things from early childhood, whether it's nature or nurture, how did that happen? How does something like that happen? It's almost inconceivable. But then you look in your own life and you think, well, the compulsions that I have, the sin that I have engaged in, how does that happen? How can I be somebody who, hates this thing that I'm doing? Like Paul says in Romans 7, I hate the very thing that I'm doing. How does that happen? So there's that very human element, but then there's also this incredible testimony of God's grace and forgiveness that can extend even to somebody like Jeffrey Dahmer. So again, I highly recommend the show. It has my endorsement, and I like the message, and I think it's great. I think it's very true of the gospel, and has a good gospel representation in the last episode. So that's the episode for today. I hope you enjoyed it, despite the dark subject matter, and have a good one. While Faith in Focus is a ministry of In Faith, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of In Faith as a mission.